Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Eric Coleman with IIST and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, Compatibility Testing for Mobile Apps and Websites by Michael Udanin. We're excited you're able to join us today. Set aside an hour to attend this webinar. This webinar is sponsored by IIST, the leaders in education-based certifications and training. For more information on how IIST can help you or your organization, please visit testinginstitute.com. Today's webinar is a preview of the full live online course that will be offered on May 9th from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Central Standard Time. If you are interested in learning more about this online course, visit testinginstitute.com/online/liveinteractive.php. This webinar is one of a series of free webinars offered by IIST. Be sure to join us for the next webinar in the series, Succeed in Agile Project Environment, Increase Collaboration Through Communication by Tammy Schwambari on April 7th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. To learn more about this and other webinars in the series, go to testinginstitute.com. You may submit your questions at any time by using your question box in your GoToWebinar window. Today's presenter will answer as many questions within the time allowed at the end of today's session. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available for viewing within 48 hours at testinginstitute.com. At the end of today's webinar, you'll be asked to complete a short survey. At IIST, we strive to provide the highest quality educational resources for the public and would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to complete this short survey. I will now turn the webinar over to today's presenter, Michael Udanin. Michael?
Thank you, Eric. Hello and welcome to our webinar. Glad to have you here. This webinar presents one subject, or perhaps even one aspect, from the two larger classes that we teach at IST, the mobile testing, a survey class on the peculiarities of mobile testing, in a sense a delta between testing in general and mobile, and a more specific focused class which focuses all on the compatibility testing for mobile devices. Right? Our next mobile compatibility testing class, which I teach for the cost of $295, and we would encourage you to learn more about this class and register at testinginstitute.com online live interactive PHP. So now, without further ado, our webinar. First, I will go quickly through a refresher on compatibility testing. Then we will focus more on the compatibility factors, which are, in my opinion, the right way to start any compatibility testing effort. And then we will, armed with the understanding of compatibility factors, we will dive right into certain aspects of compatibility tests for mobile platforms and even go through a little example here. So first, a refresher on compatibility testing. With any testing effort, we naturally want to exercise different aspects of the software under test, and to ensure not only that the functionality of the software under test is working well, but also that the performance is within the limits we expect, that the software is usable, secure, can work with other pieces of software it needs to work with, the interoperability, can survive under stress and recover from failures. Right, a very important testing, particularly for mobile devices, because they're more prone for failures due to hardware and the mode of use. You rarely drop your a desktop PC, but you certainly can drop your mobile device, go out of connectivity and so on. And other types of testing we usually exercise. Compatibility is one of them. And here we talk about software under test's ability to function as required on all supported platforms, right? So if, for example, I have a website, and today talking about website, you cannot forego mobile platforms because people will view your website on mobile devices. There is no escape from it. So when we are talking about web applications, we talk usually about two aspects, the browser and the operating system. For some web applications, you have the luxury to have a list of 2 or 3 platforms and the requirements, let's say Google Chrome and IE 11, right? For other websites, which serve pretty much the whole wide world, where you do not have a captive audience, where you don't have, for example, your company's employees who have standard company laptop with standard browser updated by your system administration all under control. If you don't have this luxury, then you need to research into which browsers are popular among your target users and so on. In a larger class, we dedicate at least 2 hours to this particular question. How do you define which platforms you need to test for, right? So here we have different IE browsers, which are quite different from each other. For example, you compare 11 to 9, and you see that they render certain JavaScript differently. HTML5 came relatively late to IE. If you look at the latest IE, the Edge, then things certainly changed. Different Firefoxes also can differ, but the difference between Firefox and IE is of course greater when within the IE. Then you have Google Chrome, which is an animal on its own. First, you have PC, Mac, and mobile versions of Google Chrome. If we talk about mobile versions for Google Chrome, we should know that the Google Chrome on iOS, iPhones, iPads, and such, and Google Chrome on Android are not the same animal. They just look similarly, right? Just like you have fish and alligators in the water, but alligator is not a fish. Same applies to Google Chrome on iOS. It uses iOS objects to render your page. Moreover, Google Chrome doesn't have regular versions. On most of the computers, it updates itself automatically as long as your computer connected to the internet. So this is something I want to take into consideration. Safari, which is the most popular browser as of now on iOS devices. But then you also have operating system. With web applications, some of them depend on the operating system because they download objects which function within the operating system, not just within the browser. And here you have plenty. You have iOS 7 and iOS 10 nowadays. You have Android operating systems, different versions and different flavor for each version. We go into details of that when we talk about mobile technologies in our series of classes on mobile testing. Same applies to Windows, right? So we certainly want to make sure that our website can work on all target platforms. And somewhere in the late 90s, that was perhaps the bulk of our web testing because because browsers were very different from each other. Today is a bit less of a pain, but guess what? With mobile today, we are where we were in, let's say, 2002, 2005, 10, 12, 15 years ago in the web world. And that's in terms of the diversity of platforms, the difference between browsers, the memory we have accessible, and so on. But there are other factors too, particularly important for mobile. And first and foremost, the hardware, right? There are aspects of the hardware which are relevant for both web applications and native apps and hybrid apps, which is an interesting mix between the two. And these are our usual suspects: the CPU, the capability of the CPU, and for some native apps, the architecture of the CPU. Think about computational intensive apps that render graphics and stuff. We have memory, which the native app uses, right? We also have special hardware. For example, many applications today use cameras. If yours is such, part of your compatibility test is to make sure it can work with different cameras and different devices. They have different resolution, for example, right? Different resolution means how heavy the picture is, because now the file is larger, right, and has a variety of implications. But there are also factors, hardware factors, which are relevant for both web and native apps, particularly the screen size, screen resolution, and the screen type, retina display versus regular display. The same image might render differently. The same screen, same page might look differently. The same font might be readable on one, not readable on another. If you're talking about mobile websites, today you have responsive design, where the very same website knows how to render itself nicely on each screen size. You certainly want to make sure it works in different screen sizes. Now, we have two major players in the mobile world today, even though these are by no means all the players: Apple and Android. Their hardware is architected differently. Their approach to hardware is different. Apple, for example, controls the hardware. For Android, anybody can manufacture Android phones. This is something to take into consideration in your compatibility testing as factors that possibly might impact the functioning of your app or your mobile website. Then you also have the operating system, another very important factor. In Apple, you have iOS versions, and they are different. If you compare 9 to 10, you see that there are lots of improvements in 10, which some people wouldn't call improvements, but changes. I wouldn't go into the very details. But every time a new iOS version comes out, we would sit down, I would sit down and go over the features and make sure that the applications I'm testing, right, would work with the new one. How? I will mark those features of the operating system that are relevant to my apps. For example, if it uses the map and I see that there were changes in the map and there were, I would certainly test those aspects on the app with the new iOS. If there were changes in hardware in the camera on the new iPhone, and there certainly were, I would go for that too, right? With Android, the picture is much more complicated. First, you have versions, right? And they name them after condiments, the marshmallow, the nougat, the latest one, and so on. And then you have flavors. And the flavors are what each and every manufacturer of Android device can change in their open source operating system. This might be relevant to the application. In particular, they want to change the internationalization, whether you switch from US to Germany or switch country and language separately, for example. For many applications, it's very relevant. Think about calculating mileage versus the number of kilometers. Another possible compatibility factor, which I want to take into consideration, would be carrier compatibility. Some applications, not all of them, but some of them, would deliver certain functionality with certain carriers, say Verizon or AT&T, but not with others. It is something to look into. There is probably no app or website for which all the possible compatibility factors are relevant, but it's good to have them in the template of your test plan. So every time you consider a new app or mobile website, you would look at this and say, okay, hardware is relevant, but only the screen size. It's a mobile website, the rest is irrelevant. Operating system, it's irrelevant because we are not doing anything sophisticated besides simple JavaScript. Carrier compatibility, oops, I need to ask my business analyst, right? Think about it as a checklist. So we have possible compatibility factors, and now I want to ask the three major compatibility questions. First, how do we know on which devices we should run the tests? There are plenty of devices. If I want to run my tests on all of them, I will never finish it, and send, as with everything which you can never finish, you usually say, okay, I will work a week on that, and then you run it on a whole lot of platforms on which you shouldn't run it, and don't run it on the really needed platforms there, right? So which devices should I run the test? Second question, how do we know what tests should I execute on which device carrier? There would be tests that I don't want to execute on every single device. Think about an application, a native app, which presents product information, right? You run a search. Let's say you are interested in home improvement. So you are, you run a search for, say, a hammer, right? You're into hammers, okay? And you get a whole list of results. And then you run a search for pliers and you get a whole list of results. And then plenty of other products. Do I need to run all those searches on every device? Certainly not. And why? Because the heavy lifting is done on the back end. On the front end, I merely present an image, perhaps, of the product, the list of products, and so on. So I need to run a few and no more. Whether it's a plier or a hammer, it's immaterial, doesn't matter. On the other hand, if I have 20 pages, I want to make sure that I see all those 20 pages or 20 screens on all my target devices, because rendering a page is something the device does, the client end does. If I have a mobile website and I have JavaScript there, I want to run it with different browsers of different devices, because that's exactly what's done on the front end. If, on the other hand, I have a report which looks exactly the same and only the data differs, and it is the backend responsible for the data, then there is no point to run it on all the devices. I need to run this report once or twice on each platform. Theoretically, once is enough. I'm paranoid I would run two, and that's about it, right? And the third question is, of course, what should the app do when installed on an unsupported platform? Now this is the most frequently forgotten question of compatibility testing, and that's sad. And here is why. Let's say that you have a native app and it has a payment screen, right? And this payment screen renders very well on your supported platforms. It renders well on, let's say, Android Nougat, right? And it renders very well on iOS 7, 8, 9, and 10, right? Very good. You know that you do not want to support iOS 6 and you don't want to support, let's say, Android Marshmallow and down. If you never tested, it well might be that the user can install this native app on, say, Marshmallow, and everything works besides the payment screen, because in devising the payment screen, your developers used an object which is not supported by earlier versions. Imagine the frustration of your user's blog posts, and so on and so forth. Perhaps calling your support and such and such and such. This is why I always want to make sure that when I'm trying, let's say, to install a native app on an unsupported platform, I get a nice, clear error message saying, unfortunately, we don't support this platform, use operating system, Nougat only, right? Now, as a test engineer, of course, I want not only to make sure it wouldn't install on an unsupported platform, I want to make sure the user gets a clear error message. Why? Not error code 27, but a clear error message in a human language. And number two, you suggest to the user what to do. When we talk in our other class on usability testing, I go into details in that. Now let's look at a mobile website. Let's say that it's supposed to support Safari for iOS. It is not supposed to support Google Chrome for iOS. We don't test for that, we don't want to support it, right? Might be a decent choice because the majority of iOS users go for a default browser. In this case, I do want to open, or to try to open, this mobile website in Google Chrome on iOS and get a nice error message. I want to avoid a situation where 90% of the application works and this one very important screen doesn't, because we use some kind of JavaScript or render control in a way which Google Chrome for a mysterious reason wouldn't do, and then boom, right? In fact, this is the easiest test run which can prevent a whole lot of trouble. So I always emphasize the need for number 3. From now on, we will be talking about questions 1 and 2, of course, which devices and what tests. And asking those 2 questions, now we need a method on how to decide, how to answer them. And here, my suggestion is a 4-step approach. We'll review it shortly in this webinar. We go, of course, into much more details in the real class. And here, I would have 4 steps. First, I want to make sure that I know who are the users. What is the user group I'm targeting? What are the user groups I'm targeting? And what are my demographics? Now, those 2 are very important, and these are kind of separate questions because it well might be that I'm targeting, let's say, the elderly, right? But my particular user group are people who are interested in playing cards online, right? And they might have different characteristics relevant to our software. For example, specifically for compatibility analysis, they might use different kinds of devices. We'll go into that in a bit more detail soon. Then, I want to ask, what are the platforms and what are the carriers if relevant? Now, this question depends on the demographics. There are some countries, for example, where iOS is used very widely, United States, Japan, Britain. There are other countries where Android is pretty much the king of the hill. And not only the king of the hill, it has more sales in the US as well, but it is used so widely that you might even forgo iOS sometimes. For good examples, Germany, Italy, India, right? You might discover that in some countries you are targeting certain platforms which have been long forgotten. In other places are still used. I don't want to offend anyone, but think about BlackBerry. In Canada, you still have a significant portion of it specifically among businessmen, right? So demographics will help you out with your platform, but we'll talk about it specifically. Then knowing the platform, you can think about the operating system and, if relevant, the browser, right? And After you answer those three, then you can answer the main question. What aspects of your app or website are sensitive to hardware and software platform differences, which will later tell you which tests to repeat on each platform. And that's the main part of compatibility testing here. But before we plunge into those 4 steps, I want to ask a question about requirements. Now consider it my little personal mission, my little personal crusade. I'm a big fan of test engineers in their testing capacity, being part of the requirements process. And why? Because we look at the requirements with a critical eye. We can spot problems in the requirements which nobody else would, because we think about errors. We think about problems. So in the context of compatibility analysis, I would ask 2 questions when I read the requirements. I will, even better, I will ask those 2 questions when I am at the requirements planning meeting to make sure that business analysts attend to them. First, do we have requirements for compatibility? It happens sometimes that people just forgo it, and that's quite sad. The second question I would ask when I have those requirements, are they adequate? If I have today requirements that my mobile website is supposed to run on a standard browser, Safari browser version for iOS 9, that's not an adequate requirement. We have iOS 10 now. If I have a requirement for Android that it's supposed to run only on the default Android browser, that might not be an adequate requirement because a whole lot of Android users download Google Chrome to Android, right? I would raise those questions to business analysis, and they will give answers after all we raise questions and find faults. But this is a very important question. Do we have requirements for compatibility, and are they adequate indeed? And not peculiar to mobile, it's of course a relevant question for any compatibility testing. So now demographics. The question here is, who is using our app or website? And there can be different answers. It can be general public, right? And if it's the whole wide world, that's my toughest case, because I need to figure out what do I do, for example, with different alphabets, right? Call it part of the functional testing, part of the compatibility testing, don't care. I want to make sure that we catch that. Will users be entering data in non-Latin characters? Big question indeed. What do we do then? How do we test it, right? What about the weights and measures? If I'm supposed to track mileage and I go from US to Canada, Canada has kilometers, do I allow the user to choose? Do I need to check now the compatibility in terms of being able to calculate the number of miles per 5 kilometers and the other way around? All those questions can be very relevant here. Later I will ask questions about platforms as well. If we think about, let's say, US versus EU, the proliferation of Android is different. If we think about US versus India, and India have a whole variety of different devices. It's a more diverse market in this sense than the United States. In China, you have a variety of devices which are not used as much in other countries as they use in China, and so on. But then it well might be that we are targeting some specific groups. Think about businessmen. There are lots of apps which serve business people. Now this imposes certain compatibility requirements because, for example, lots of business people still use BlackBerries, right? If you use doctors, you want to consider things like not at your desk use. Call it compatibility, call it usability, I want to cover it. How easy it is to use our application when it's not laying on the desk or in your lap. How easy it is to use when you are holding it in one hand. Moreover, if we think about doctors, then we might want to research which platform is most popular among our target population. And we'll discover it might be iOS. Same applies to academics. In academia, Mac integration is the rule. Macs have much of a proliferation. They are same as in the medical world. If we are thinking about traveling public, I want to make sure that we cover a variety of tests with reduced connectivity, with reduced reception, right? With switching from one provider to another, right? I also want to make sure that usability-wise, again, that's where compatibility borders usability, that all those different devices of ours can work with different type of lighting, because people are hanging out in the airport and train stations, and the lighting can be different. College students, seniors, I want to make sure that I know my population because this might drive further questions. And then I want to check the hardware usage and software usage within this population, which platforms are more popular in my target population here, right? Now, when I look at hardware, first I want to categorize hardware as well. Is our native app and or mobile website and or hybrid app are going to be used on a smartphone, tablet, or other? We know, for example, that the proliferation of iOS and tablets is different than in smartphones. And there are places, of course, to check statistics. That's what we, again, go deeply into the larger class. Manufacturer, if we are talking about Android manufacturers tend to over-customize things. They can do it. It's open source. Is display size relevant for our application? For most of the apps and for all the websites, the answer is, well, yes. Is resolution relevant? Are we going to present videos? Are we going to present images? You see that I'm starting to talk about certain types of functionality that we need to run on different platforms, right? Because those considerations certainly drive it. One of the more important questions here is the question about special hardware. Are we going to utilize the camera? If the answer is yes, then I must have in my lab devices with cameras of different resolution. If we are talking about iPhone 7, for example, it has two types, the regular and plus, as they had the 6, but they have very different cameras, very differently architected cameras. I must have those. Are we going to do barcode scanning? If this is the case, then of course, as a functional tester, I need barcode samples, right? As a compatibility person, I see, well, are we going to use it with a standard stock and barrel camera, or we are going to use it with special cameras and obtain those from my lab? Are we going to do credit card scanning? What type of credit card scanning devices do we support? Need to have them in my lab. Are we going to use location? If this is the case, are we going to use devices which use more than just GPS or alternative to GPS? For example, European Galileo, Russian GLONASS, Chinese Baidu, and so on. If this is the case, I need a way to simulate them if it's relevant to our app. Of course, if I have a website which all what it does sends to the device the coordinates, then probably not. But if we have some sophisticated geo app, this might be relevant. And then there can be plenty of other types of special hardware for the compatibility with which I want to test our native app. So here we have another list of factors. And then software. Now, knowing what our target populations, we now know which hardware do we use. And now I want to answer the question, which operating systems are using this hardware. For example, if I'm targeting the whole wide world, I cannot forgo iOS. I also want to make sure that I have the stats on how in the whole wide world people go in terms of the operating system version, the iOS version. How many still have iOS 8, how many 9, how many 10, right? Naturally, I cannot forgo 10 because Apple will push it to everybody sooner or later. The question is if I can forgo 8, right? I need some statistics for that, and there are places to get them. Stats.com and quite a few more, which we talk about in the larger class. You also might have statistics from your users. One unfortunately little known fact is that unless you switch logging on your web server, every time somebody hits your URL, your company URL, for example, your server records which browser was used. And the browser here is not just, hey, it is Google Chrome, but Google Chrome from which platform? PC or Mac or mobile iOS device or mobile Android device. This is very valuable information because it allows you to look at what your current users are utilizing rather than just the whole wide world. But this is also a pitfall. When I am relying only on my current users, I'm ignoring the question, what if we are creating a new version to support new user populations? And as a test engineer, I want to ask the second question. Sometimes I would go to salespeople with that question. And if the answer is, oh yeah, we're going to expand to college students, then when I think about iOS versions, I need to think about latest and greatest. Same applies to Android. But with Android, the field, of course, is much wider in terms of the diversity of versions and flavors and manufacturer customizations, which are usually flavors, right? Again, I can use my log, I can look into general stats. If I am limited by the target population, let's say I am targeting traveling families, then my job is easier. In terms of hardware, for example, I'm very likely to have my application run on tablets. That's how traveling families entertain kids, right? They usually have tablet with them, and if they want to run a sophisticated web search, they will grab a tablet. It's easier, right? But then I also will look into what is usually used by families rather than, let's say, single individuals. Right? There is another aspect of our operating system, jailbreaking or rooting. Now, I wouldn't go into the details here we discussed in the technology class, but in a nutshell, jailbreak is giving the user access to what Apple usually has on your iOS device, and rooting is giving you access that Google Play has on your Android device. It's not really breaking much. It's not getting into somebody's data. It's basically allowing the user to install new apps, for example, directly, not through the App Store. Now, millions of devices are jailbroken and rooted. Nobody has the exact number, of course, but it's very common. So if your application is not supposed to support jailbroken or rooted devices, then of course you need one in your lab and to run some tests. If it's supposed to, and there is anything in your app which might be relevant to jailbreaking or rooting, which is rare, then you need to test for compatibility there. Okay? And then of course we have the browser. Now for each platform I usually would divide them into two categories, standard and installed. For iOS you have versions of Google Chrome, for example, but they use iOS objects, and very few users use Google Chrome on iOS. In general, and your target population might be different, you might want to check it. So there I will feel a bit more comfortable with testing on Safari only if I don't have time. On the other hand, on Android, a whole lot of people install Google Chrome for Android. Well, thinking about business ownership of Android, you know why. So there, I cannot forego the tests that are relevant for the difference between standard Android browser and Google Chrome for Android. I must run them. Right. So here I do similar mapping to what I've done with the operating system. Right. Now, a word of caution here. Some apps, few apps, but still some, communicate not only with the operating system, but also with other apps installed on the same device. If this is the case, if this is your case, then you will have a third item here. I call them the neighbors. Right. You need to make sure that you test it for compatibility with different versions of those neighbors. Think about, for example, something that creates an Excel spreadsheet and stores it into local storage on the device, so later mobile Excel can pick it up. You want to make sure that your spreadsheet can be opened by different versions of mobile Excel. That's what I'm talking about. Okay, so after all that, so now the technology, the third question. Which parts of our application, native app, or mobile device or application under test, are sensitive to the different aspects that we just discussed, to hardware, to software, to browser, so on and so forth. And to talk about that, let's think about an example. That's an imaginary application, but I'm sure you've seen many similar ones. Perhaps even tested similar ones. FindDoc is a mobile website which enables users to find physicians by criteria. For example, I can say, find a family doctor in the radius of 20 miles from where I am, right? Parents traveling with kids, and kids, as everybody who has kids knows, tend to get sick when you travel, right? Or, for example, I'm in the airport in Atlanta, Georgia, flying to, let's say, New York. So, and my kid is getting sick, so I want to find somebody in New York, because we are already boarding the plane or sitting on the plane, right? By address. I might want to find somebody by specialization. I'm a traveling businessman. I had a very stressful meeting. I want a psychiatrist right now, right? Find somebody by ranking. I want a good psychiatrist. Opening hours, somebody who is open at 3 a.m. and so on and so forth, right? So that's the main functionality. Nature, it requires internet connection to function. It's a website after all, right? It utilizes a backend database that is a web-based management interface, so somebody can add doctors, remove doctors, and so on. Each update of the backend database will be reflected on the mobile end within 5 minutes, right? Think about browser refresh. The application is free and serves ads that are renewed every set interval of time. Now this tells me as a test engineer a lot. This tells me who is paying my salary. These are people who push ads to us. This tells me that I need to test this functionality very well. This also will push me to ask a question, where do these ads come from? Ads are also notoriously bad in terms of compatibility. So I want to take this into consideration. Right? How they're served, what is presented, is it an image, is it a text, is it a mix, is it full screen, is it half screen, and so on and so forth. And then the last one, FineDoc can be used in the US, Canada, Germany, and Japan. Now this tells me quite a bit about the functionality we'll have to test functional-wise. For example, internationalization. In Japan, people speak Japanese. Japanese has 3 alphabets. I want to make sure it works with all of them. In Germany, they speak German. German has long words. I want to make sure that when I say, okay, show it to me, select German, that my screen doesn't get garbled suddenly because the words are so long and my responsive design went awry. When I'm in Canada, I want to make sure kilometers work, and the gallon is the Canadian gallon if I use any gallons here, right? And I don't say 5, but mean kilometers, and actually it's miles, right? So now, thinking about that, I first think about the users, right? Who are my target users? Well, I can think about 2 here. Traveling businessmen, right? And parents with kids, parents traveling with kids. Chances are that traveling college students wouldn't be really interested in FineDoc. If something happens, they will call mom and dad, right? Now, I want to verify this assumption of mine with our business analysts and perhaps salespeople, product managers, right? If this is the case, let's assume this is the case, then I look at the hardware which we might have. I research the popularity of different hardware platforms in my target population, traveling businessmen, parent with kids. Since we have parent with kids, a lot of different tablets come to mind. Since we have traveling businessmen, I probably cannot still forget about BlackBerry. Many of them have it still, but it's subject, to check it, right? From here, I will learn about the software relevant to it. And the biggest relevance here is the browser. Granted that I don't have any other peculiar requirements, I probably shouldn't care that much about the operating system. I would check the major ones, but I wouldn't go into Android flavors. And why? Because it's a website. My customizations for a country is probably just selecting a little flag, and it's all done at the web level. It doesn't go into the local devices setting. It wouldn't get the German language from me from the device, but rather when I select it from a drop-down. And as a test engineer, by the way, that's what I would expect here from the requirements, because otherwise, what do we do with a German person traveling in the US, or German person who bought a US cell phone? Suddenly this person wouldn't be able to switch to German unless he switches the whole device. It doesn't make sense, right? So here we'll focus on the browser, right? Based on the platforms that I know of, iOS, Android, BlackBerry, right? Let's assume that these are the 98% of my users. Then I would research which browsers are they likely to use. Certainly Safari for iOS comes to mind. Perhaps different versions of it. We'll answer this question in a few moments. Certainly Android default browser comes to mind. Certainly Google Chrome for Android comes to mind. Certainly default browser for BlackBerry. People on BlackBerry usually leave defaults. Based on my experience with BlackBerry, people don't install that much, and there is not much to install. Again, no offense to BlackBerry. So here then, I have a list of browsers. And now the main piece. Okay? What functionality will be sensitive to software and hardware combinations? First, it's a website. The biggest thing that is sensitive to browser on the website is, of course, the rendering of the screen and the JavaScript. So I want to make sure that I can see each screen of mine on each target platform, which differ in terms of size of the screen and the browser, right? And it renders the screen correctly. I want to make sure that every place where I exercise my JavaScript, it exercises correctly in different browsers, right? I want to make sure that every time I select a new language, it still presents the screen correctly, right? We will verify that the captions are correct in the target language some other time. For now, compatibility testing to make sure you can see it correctly. It's not garbled. You don't see a row of question marks instead of Japanese hiragana, for example, right? And here we get to good old friend of ours, the compatibility table, compatibility matrix, right? So here, this is a grossly simplified one, of course, right? Your real one would be much larger. But here we take all what we know about compatibility testing and implement in terms of which tests do we run on different platforms. So let's say we still want BlackBerry because of a business plan, right? Now, BlackBerry would have its default browser. It would have more than one for different BlackBerries, but let's assume for the sake of example, right? We can have two types of connections, the net and Wi-Fi, right? The regular cellular network and the Wi-Fi, right? And we have the functionality of search by address. Now, I probably devised a very nice list of different addresses to search for in one country, in another country, in a large city, in a small city, and with suite and without suite. I did so much testing with addresses, ones that I can talk about it for hours. Do I need to run each and every search, though, on every device here? The answer is a resounding no. And why it's a resounding no? Because the heavy lifting is done by the backend. I want to run it at least once on each platform to make sure that the results are displayed correctly. All what my front end does is displaying them, and that's it. I would look up one address in the US, let's say one address in Japan, one in net, one in Wi-Fi, because I just want to run at least one test in each combination. That's it. I will choose the most common platform. Let's say it's my iPad 3, and we will run all of them in all configurations, right? But the rest, no need. Heavy lifting is done by the backend. Same applies to current location. Now here, I want to make sure that we communicate with GPS correctly on each platform, right? That it doesn't time out when we have a low reception, for example, regular net connectivity, but that's it. The rest is done by the database on the backend. So here again, we run all of them in the most common configuration, but no more than that. Then comes the ads display. And that's a very interesting one. First, it's a major, very important functionality. Without that, we wouldn't have revenue, nobody will pay our wages. Moreover, if it's displayed in such a way that it's very inconvenient for the user will just abandon our website. I mean, let's be honest, nobody goes to a website to see ads. Perhaps only those who provide the ads, right? But maybe they don't because they don't want to pay you per impression, right? So you want to make sure that ads are displayed correctly, don't disable the rest of the HTML and so on. Also, the presentation of ads, the display of ads is done by the front end. So I want to make sure I test them on as many places needed. Let's say that I have 3 test cases for ads display, the large ad, half screen ad, and small ad, right? So I will run all of them on BlackBerry with both configurations, net and Wi-Fi, very important. Ads might take time to load. I want to make sure they don't time out when you have a low reception. And we talk in a larger class, how do you simulate low reception, right? I want to run them on most common platform. I want to run all of them on the Galaxy platform with, its Safari and Chrome. Do I need to run all of them on all the iOS platforms? My answer would be no. I'm willing to take this risk. And why? Because the rendering of the ad depends on the browser and perhaps maybe for some ads a bit on the operating system type. But the difference here between iPad mini and iPad 3 would be minuscule. If we're talking about the size, Galaxy will give us that. If country configuration is done at the device level, then I want to do it for each operating system here. perhaps for each browser, but I don't need to repeat it really for each combination. And of course, I want to make sure that our website is not displayed on unsupported platforms. Now, before we open it to questions, few words, before a few last slides, few words about, many of you are perhaps wondering, where do I get all this data, right? I might not be as technically savvy as to answer all these questions, and that's totally legitimate. As test engineers, we work mostly in the analytic realm, and this is why we have developers and architects. Very frequently, while planning the compatibility testing, I will go to the system architect, to the developers, and ask them questions. For example, how are the ads implemented? Are they sensitive for platform change, for browser change? What might be sensitive there? My experience is that not only you get a very relevant information, but you also establish good relationship with the development team. They see that your intent is not only to trample on them and find all the errors and say wahaha, right? Same applies to other areas. I would go and ask, for example, well, where do we have JavaScript? How much JavaScript? How complex it is? Do you think it is relevant to different platforms? I might want to do my own little research as well here. And then I will build a matrix where we don't do the work we don't need. For example, rerunning all the searches on all the platforms, but focus where the bugs might lurk. Now, this kind of work is always bound with a certain risk analysis. If you have time constraints, never happens to us, but happens to some other people, then of course you might think about which kind of test you might forego here, right? This table gives you a rational basis to make the decision. You know why you want to run all the ads on a BlackBerry configurations, right? You know that you want to run all of them in net and Wi-Fi because you fear that the speed of serving the ads would be different, right? Is this something that you can forego for the urgent hot fix? That's a question you can ask. This table will provide you some data because you know why you're repeating things. Now that's the time for questions, right? Please submit if you have any, and please submit them now. And now while you are typing your questions, few words about our mobile testing class, which is a survey class, and each topic of which is a focus for another special class. In the larger class, we start with the state of the mobile, where we have a survey of the statistics and how you obtain the statistics relevant for planning your tests. The technology, usually in this class I also focus on the latest and greatest in terms of technology, and this is why I have to update it all the time, and what it means for testing. Then we discuss a bit mobile testing challenges, not only compatibility but all other kinds of challenges, there are plenty. And from there we continue to the testing approach, where we also do quite a few exercises. We discuss relatively in detail functional, performance, compatibility, usability, security, interoperability, survivability and recovery, user acceptance testing. We also discuss production monitoring, a frequently forgotten aspect. We go relatively in depth into how you plan your mobile test lab. Do you buy devices? Do you use somebody else's devices and such? And we discuss naturally automating mobile tests, right? And even have a little video of a demo, a little demo of how it can be done in a bit of an unconventional way, right? It was my great pleasure to deliver this webinar to you today. You are most welcome to go to our Facebook, or subscribe to our Twitter account, see us on LinkedIn and on YouTube. As Eric mentioned, you know, we post lots of things on YouTube, and you can get plenty of information here, enroll in our classes and see what we do otherwise. Thank you very much. Eric?
Thank you, Michael. It does look like we have a few questions there from the attendees today.
Interestingly enough, I do not see them.
Okay, I'll read the first one. One person is asking, what tools do you recommend for testing mobile devices?
I always get it. Thank you for this question. I always get that. So how about this? Instead of recommending a specific tool, I'll suggest a couple of criteria how to choose one and describe the tools in this context, automation tools. So my first criteria is which platforms I need supported. If we are solely iOS shop and we will never do anything else, then I can look at tools which work primarily and better with iOS, but with iOS alone, and there are a few of those. The Cucumber, for example, comes to mind. In most cases, though, I do not want to limit myself to a particular platform. I want tools which have a potential to support more than one platform, right? For example, we have Appium, which builds upon Selenium and supports more than one platform. It supports Android and iOS, which covers the majority of the market. So this is certainly something which I would consider when I use more than one platform, right? Another question I would ask is the technology. If we are doing only mobile websites, then perhaps even a stripped down version of Appium would work, right? If we are doing both native apps and mobile websites, and we are doing them on Android and iOS platform, then I need something like a full-blown Appium because it would support native apps as well. But then I would ask another question, the technological questions. For example, how much time and effort I want to invest in having my test engineers learning real programming. Tools like Appium, like Selenium in general, require in-depth programming skills, right? Much more than, let's say, needed for the good old quick test professional. So that's certainly a consideration. Do I have any exotic platforms? Do I have applications which might not be supported by common stock tools, right? If this is the case, then I can think about other options. In fact, it is possible to use your regular test automation tools like QTP, for example, or Test Complete or others to test mobile devices. That's where you access them remotely. See the screen of the mobile device on your PC screen, just like you do with the VNC remote access. And then click on it, read text from it using OCR and so on. This is a bit more complex technique, even though it doesn't require as much programming knowledge as, let's say, Appium. And this is something which you might want to go for if you want to support theoretically any platform that requires remote control. However, it does require jailbreaking and routing. If your company objects to jailbreaking and routing, then you have tools which do instrumentation, where you plant a little piece of a tool provider's code inside your native app, or use a special browser where you will open a mobile website, and then they control only this piece of your device remotely, only the application under test. A Telerik tool, for example, does that. I don't remember its exact name. It's called instrumentation. It has, of course, its shortcomings. If you don't take this piece before release, then the security will be compromised naturally. You cannot do a control of the whole device with instrumentation and stuff. So I guess my message is there are many tools. First, think about what your criteria are, and then, armed with those criteria, choose the tool that you want. Now, in the larger class, of course, we spend much more time to discuss this particular question. Hope I answered your question. Next question.
Yes. How much time should we invest in orientation testing?
If under orientation testing you mean just going around the application and browsing different screens and stuff, and not just exploratory testing, so if the former is the case, your orientation testing is going around, then my answer is as much as needed. I certainly want to have every single screen of my app, every single page of my website browsed on all my target devices to make sure it renders properly. I want to make sure that my navigation works on every target platform. That's usually a pitfall. Now, that's usually an Achilles heel of applications. Now, thankfully, this kind of testing is relatively easy to automate, the navigation testing. You have your automation tool. All what it does, it clicks different links, different buttons, grabs the picture of the next screen and verifies major elements. And then you quickly go through a test report and see that no screen is garbled. So here automation can help you a lot. Indeed, mobile test automation, by the way, is not just a big help, it's a must, because typing on a mobile device takes much more time, and you have more platforms than on in your regular PC or Mac-based testing. So here automation can be of a big help. If I misunderstood your question in terms of orientation, please let me know. Next question.
It does look like that's all the questions that we have today, Michael.
Great. Well, frankly, devising this webinar, I changed it from time to time based on the question I had been asked before. So thank you very much. It was my pleasure, delivering this webinar to you today, and hope to see you in our classes. Eric.
Yes, thank you, Michael. I appreciate your time today, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for today's free webinar sponsored by IIST, the leaders in education-based certifications and training. For more information on how IIST can help you or your organization, please visit testinginstitute.com. Again, be sure to join us for the next webinar in the series, Succeed in Agile Project Environment, Increase Collaboration Through Communication by Tammy Schwambari on April 7th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. To learn more about this and other webinars in the series, go to testinginstitute.com. You can follow IIST on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube to find out more information about IIST news, events, and promotions. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great day. Thank you, Michael.